Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Leading the Toxic Employee. This training is brought to you by Commercial Electronics. If you'd like to learn more about our recording solution, our third-party quality assurance services, or our newest product, Live 911, visit comelectronics.com. This webinar is part of our public safety education series, and you can view our upcoming webinars on our training page at comelectronics.com/training. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you're listening in using your computer speaker system, you're automatically muted to eliminate background noise. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select the handset in the audio pane at the bottom right, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit questions about today's lesson at any time by typing your questions into the Q&A pane at the control panel, and I'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For those of you wanting to report this training to your state certification or licensing agency, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. My name is Beth English, and I'm your instructor today. I began my 911 career as a police dispatcher 33 years ago. I was very young, and most recently served as a communications director before joining Commercial Electronics as the program manager for their QA/QI program and higher ground instructor. I have my master's telecommunicator license from Texas. I'm a TCOL instructor and a past president of Texas NENA. So let's get started with our session. Today's objectives. We are going to identify types of toxic employees. We're going to identify ways of dealing with those toxic employees. We're also going to identify types of toxic bosses and identify ways of protecting ourselves from toxic bosses. Now, toxic employees come in all forms. You've got the gossip, the bully, the slacker, and they're all destructive to your agency and distracting to your other employees. They're like a cancer seeping into the corners of the workplace. They destroy morale, they sap the energy from their coworkers, and they poison everything and everyone. Let's face it, we've all worked with a toxic employee at one time or another. We've all felt the dread of going to work because of the issues caused by their toxicity, the negativity that their toxicity generates, and the atmosphere in the room that you could cut with a butter knife. And many times, they are the best dispatchers. But you have to ask yourself, are they worth it? We often find ourselves keeping them as employees because we can't afford to lose anyone else, and that just makes it worse. So how do we lead these people? Can they be led, and do we even want to lead them? Now, as children, we are taught to get along with others, play nice, share our toys, and help others. Where along the way did we lose these lessons? Why is it that as adults, we have trouble getting along and we have toxic workplaces? Well, one reason is that we don't have a clearly defined definition of what our agency culture should look like. We hire employees, we throw them in the ring, and then let the culture develop on its own. And we basically allow negativity to become the norm. We're so desperate to fill empty positions that we hire someone who can do the job without even looking at how they'll fit in with the team. We ignore warning signs in the interest of getting the positions filled, And this actually does more harm than good, as those new employees may be the ones who bring the toxicity into the agency. I will tell you, one employee I hired came from another agency. She had been let go when the new administration took over, which is fairly normal. And when I interviewed her, she said several times that she was old, which I discounted because she was younger than I was. She was polite, well-dressed, well-mannered, and she had experience. So I ignored the warning signs that I was seeing, and I hired her. And I'm sorry about the barking dog. Within 6 months, actually not even 6 months, it was closer to 6 weeks, she had turned the center upside down and had all the employees pitted against each other. She was eventually terminated for inappropriate emails to another employee while on duty, after which she filed an EEOC complaint against me for age discrimination. Now, it's easy to spot the behaviors that are blatantly unacceptable, such as sexual harassment or theft, but the behaviors that make our centers toxic are more subtle and can be difficult to identify and correct. So let's look at the different types of toxic employees and how we can lead them. Okay, before we go on with this one, let's take a poll. Okay, have you ever worked with a toxic employee? Well, so far, yes, got several that have worked with a toxic employee. It's kind of hard to get away from it. If you've got more than 2 people in the room, then you're generally going to have someone who's toxic. So, and nobody says no. They've been very fortunate. Okay, so let's go back to our toxic employees, and let's talk about the gossip. Now, gossip can be anything from truth to rumors to blatant lies. It can serve as a useful purpose in building trust and group bonding, but on the other hand, it's generally spread behind the back of the person the gossip is about, and most times it's done in a mean spirit. There are times when it's just intended to be funny, like, hey, did you hear how John pronounced Bodark? He said Boys the Ark. But more often, it's just mean, and it's done with the intention of maligning someone, causing them problems, or ruining their career. So take, for instance, the employee who would call the spouses of people that she worked with and tell them their spouse was sleeping with someone at work. If she was questioned about it, she would admit that she had done it out of concern for the wife because, quote unquote, she needed to know. And depending on the circumstances, some people lost their jobs, their careers, and their families. Then there's the gossip who knows everything about everyone. He knows where everyone lives. He knows everyone's spouse and children. He knows who just got terminated and the complete details as to why. He has all the officers' personal cell phone numbers in his contact list. And because he knows everything about everyone, he likes to throw out little tidbits of information to his coworkers. If someone gets angry about it, then he says, he was just joking. He'll say, I love you and I'd never say anything bad about you. What about the employee who needs to feel better about herself? So she gossips about everyone else and about how they don't know what they're doing. She makes sure that all the other employees, both in the comm center and out on the street, know that she's the only one who knows how to do the job right, when in actuality, she makes more mistakes than anyone, but she knows how to cover them up. She makes everyone think she's the best at the job so that when they need help, they call her each time. Other employees like to talk about how bad others are to work with. I had experience with this when I very first started my career. One of the dispatchers on midnights told me all about how difficult the day shift supervisor was to get along with, and if she didn't like you, she'd get rid of you. Now, I heard this over and over for the first 6 weeks that I was on the job. So by the time I went to the day shift, I was scared to death. There was another trainee who was hired at the same time I was, who was so scared by what she heard that she quit before she could even go to day shift. Each of these employees has one thing in common. They cause dissension and low morale, the two things that you try to keep out of your center. So, can you do anything with these employees? How do you deal with them? Well, let's move forward and talk about that. Okay, so dealing with the gossip. Many times, gossip starts because someone's bored or they're dissatisfied with their work situation. If you stop and think about it, the worst gossipers are usually going to be your best dispatcher. So it stands to reason that they're bored because the job is so easy for them. Some of them just want to be seen as more powerful, more in the know, or better than others. But something else that you should consider is if their behavior is because of a lack of policies, clear directions, or expectations. If so, your first strategy is to be clear about what you consider to be appropriate behavior. Everyone needs to know what behavior is expected and what behavior will and will not be tolerated. Generally, it's best to do this in one meeting if you can, so everyone gets the exact same message. So let's do another poll here. Does your agency have clear policies about gossiping? Okay, half and half. Okay, still about half and half. Okay. So in one agency that I worked for, we had a very toxic environment because of negative talk, complaining, disgruntled employees. And when I took charge of one of the shifts, I told everyone that I would not tolerate the gossiping, the backbiting, or the bad attitudes. I also told them that if others worked the shift on overtime and wanted to start gossiping or talking bad about others, short of physical violence, I wanted it stopped. I told them they could change the subject, walk away, or tell the other employee they didn't want to talk about it, but the gossiping wasn't going to be tolerated. Within 3 months, the shift had turned around. The ones who were causing the biggest problems transferred out to other departments in the city, and the rest of them just fell in line with the new policies. It can be done, but it takes everyone working on it together. Now, in this agency that I worked for, there had never been any discussion of what was expected in the way of employee behavior. Like I said earlier, employees were hired and left to determine what the culture was going to be. So it's up to you to set the expectations of the culture and the acceptable actions of your employees. Okay, if anybody is having trouble hearing me, let me know. Okay, so in addition to setting the ground rules about expected behavior, you can provide regular redirection. When you hear the employee heading down that path, you can redirect them by changing the subject, giving them a task to do, or sending them on a break. Anything that redirects their attention or energy can help keep that unacceptable behavior in check. Now, if you still can't get an employee on board with your expectations or by redirecting their attention, then it may be time to consider termination. So, can you terminate a gossip? Yes, that's the answer. Now, many agencies are considered at-will employers, which means they can fire anyone at any time for any reason. That's the definition of at-will, but if you've ever tried to terminate an employee, you know no such thing exists. We have to have documentation of everything they've done wrong, when they were counseled, how many times they were counseled about the same issue, and the consequences of their actions or their inaction. Some agencies are union or civil service, which means they have to follow due process, and they have to have just cause in order to terminate an employee. As different as the two are, even at-will agencies will follow due process in order to avoid grievances and termination hearings. And due process means a specific process is followed, which includes documentation, written warnings, a 90-day PIP, notification of proposed removal from the position, and a 30-day chance to dispute the allegations of poor performance or misconduct. The biggest difference is that at-will employees don't get a 30-day waiting period after they're notified of intent to remove them from the position. But whether your agency is at-will or civil service, you can terminate an employee for gossiping because it's considered creating a hostile work environment. Keep in mind that the gossip rarely talks about any one thing that's going to bring about a big incident with a formal complaint, an IA investigation, and termination as a result. Generally, it's going to happen in little bits and pieces that chip away at the morale of the department until you've got that toxic environment. So you'll need to document the small incidents as they happen, the result of the incident, and each conversation you've had with the employee about the behavior. And going through the process of progressive discipline will cover you whether you're an at-will employer, unionized, or civil service. So let's look at the next type of toxic person, the bully. It might help if we look at why people bully to begin with. Bullies like to pick on people who appear weaker than they are and who don't have a lot of confidence. They like the feeling of control that they get with their bullying. It's a way for them to appear to be better than their coworkers. They're often jealous of those who can do the job as well, if not better than they can. But rather than working harder to acquire the skills of their coworker, they would rather bring the coworker down to a point lower than themselves. They may prefer to work with someone who is more like them, so they bully the coworker who isn't. And then some bullies just like to stir up dissension and then sit back and watch the workplace culture circle the drain. And some just like to make life difficult for others. Now, needless to say, a bully is toxic to the agency, and you may have even had to deal with one in the past. In one way or another, most of your toxic employees are also going to be bullies. Some of them are blatant about it, while others are more subtle. In fact, as we discuss the tactics that bullies use, you'll see that gossiping is actually a form of bullying. So let's look at some of the overt tactics that are used by bullies. Bullies make false accusations. They accuse you of things that you may or may not have done. Some bullies use anger to try to control others. If you were on the webinar last month, you might remember me telling you about an employee came into my office and leaned over my desk while she threatened me. She regularly used anger to control others in the comm center. When you have a bully in charge, they will often claim false policies as a way to benefit themselves. I had a CTO at one agency that would make up random rules for the trainees to follow, even though she wouldn't follow them herself. They'll single out a target and try to isolate them from others. And bullies will hold their target to a different standard. They will criticize and bully them for their performance. They'll spread false rumors about their target in order to ruin their reputation. And not all tactics used by bullies are as overt as these. They'll do things that are extremely difficult to prove, like they'll use body language to intimidate others. They'll use the silent treatment to try to cut their target off from the group. And they'll disregard satisfactory work. The CTO that I mentioned earlier had a certain order that she would put the paperwork in when she would compile an arrest packet for the officers. If her trainees didn't put the paperwork in that exact order, she told them it was incorrect. Now, all of these tactics cause toxicity in the agency. It makes employees dread coming to work, especially those who might be the target of a bully, and there can be more than one target. If it's left unchecked, the bully can ruin the entire culture of an agency. Now, because bullying is often the result of jealousy or feelings of inferiority, one way of dealing with bullies is to meet the needs that they feel aren't being met. I know this sounds completely opposite of what you would want to do, but offering praise for a job well done can offset those feelings of inferiority and lessen the jealousy that they may be feeling for other employees. You can provide them with extra responsibility, such as maintenance of a database in CAD or teaching NCIC classes, things like that, that can also give them that feeling of superiority that they want without them having to bully someone else or affect the agency's culture. But if that doesn't work, then it's time to try a new tactic. And bullying is often done very subtly with little overt action, so the best way to manage a bully is to start by looking for patterns of bullying. You may not be able to physically observe what's happening, but you can observe the results of it. So for example, you hire 6 new people and you lose 4 of them within 6 months. They won't give an exit interview and they list personal as their reason for leaving. This can be a red flag. One agency had been through 17 trainees in a 2-year period. The city manager felt that there were problems that were not being addressed. So she hired a new manager to try to get to the bottom of it. Within 2 months, the manager had discovered that the trainees were being bullied, and it was being done in the open in front of other employees. They were being ridiculed for making mistakes, and they were being physically shoved back from the phone so their trainers could take over the phone calls. Now, once the issue was identified, the new manager started holding employees accountable for their actions. He had conversations with the trainers about the way that they were treating the trainees and what his future expectations were for future actions. Because bullies like to operate in a culture of silence and fear, they count on their targets remaining quiet about their behavior. So the best way to deal with a bully is to bring their behavior out in the open and confront them about it. Now, keep in mind, when I say confront them, this isn't meant to imply that you need to call them out in front of others, but instead you need to have a conversation with the bully, letting them know that you know what they're doing. Now, as in any other conversation with an employee, it should never be one in which you use personal pronouns such as you, like you treat the trainees terribly when they make a mistake, because that's going to be taken personally. Instead, you might try, let's talk about the proper way to address trainee mistakes. If the bullying involves ridiculing another employee, the bully may claim they were only joking. In this case, you would want to persist because corrective action will only work if you're not giving in like the bully expects. You should also address the employee that you feel is being bullied. Talk about the situation with them and see if they would like for you to act as a mediator between them and the bully. Many times the bullied employee will not want to address the situation themselves because of fear of retaliation. But regardless of whether the bullied employee decides to participate in a discussion or not, it should still be made clear to the bully that any retaliation will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Then you've got the slacker. The slacker does what's absolutely necessary to get by on the job and nothing more. They come to work just on time. They answer the phone only when it becomes apparent that no one else is going to. And they dispatch the calls without doing any extra investigation, like into vehicle descriptions, previous events, or even calling the complainant back to verify information. They leave those little details up to everyone else. When there's downtime, they spend their time looking at magazines, surfing the internet, or playing games rather than doing work like validations or warrant audits. And then when the shift is shorthanded, they don't volunteer to help with the overtime. They have to be directed to work. If a volunteer is needed for any extracurricular duties such as National Night Out, they prefer not to participate. And again, they'll only do so if they're ordered to. They also fail to show up for mandated meetings, and they prefer not to participate in any shift parties, potlucks, or get-togethers. They may also participate in some inappropriate activities while on duty, such as taking too many breaks, returning from breaks late, or leaving without even briefing their relief. Slackers are considered toxic because of the extra workload that gets put on everyone else to make up for, well, their slackiness. Other employees get overwhelmed and frustrated with always having to cover their work that the slacker should be doing. And not only does the extra work frustrate the other employees, but so does the lack of participation in shift get-togethers and potlucks and things like that that are meant to build rapport on the shift. So, dealing with the slacker. The first approach to dealing with the slacker is to determine if there's some underlying reason for their lack of motivation. It could be a systemic problem rather than an individual problem. There may be some hidden resentments behind their lack of interest. you need to find out, is there something going on in the agency that keeps them demotivated? If not, is there something in their personal life that's distracting them from their work? And once you determine that, then you can decide which direction to go with correction. Now, if there's nothing at work if there's nothing at work or in their personal life that's preventing them from performing their job satisfactorily, then it's time to tackle the problem of their slack. So you first need to establish the workload that is expected of everyone, including the slacker. You'll set clear expectations for them, and then once you do, you need to schedule regular follow-up meetings with them to discuss their progress. It would also be a good idea to have some surprise visits to their shift to check on their progress, just to see how things are when you're not there, making sure that things are going the way they should. And then you always want to remember to reward any employee, but reward these employees for any progress made. They're not the top performer in your agency, but they're still susceptible to praise and the motivation that it can provide. The hot mess is exactly what the name implies, a hot mess. This employee may have been a stellar employee at one time, but no longer. It's all they can do to get to work. They often show up looking like they rolled out of bed and got in the car to come to work. Their hair is uncombed, their clothes are wrinkled, and they either have on no makeup or they're unshaven. They may have worked for the agency for several years, or it may be a new employee just out of training, but they have no time on the books. So as soon as sick and vacation are posted to their account, they use it. You can count on them to call in sick either on their Friday or their Monday, and being sick on holidays are a given. You end up requiring them to have a doctor's note for any absence, and they'll readily provide it. They're constantly making mistakes in call sheets and asking their supervisors to correct them. They can't remember from day to day how to perform everyday tasks, and they're constantly having to ask for help. You have to listen to their calls because they're making so many mistakes, and you find yourself constantly documenting them. They're completely disorganized, and they seem to be helpless. They may also constantly whine about something, whether it's how bad they feel, how their children are behaving, or even how bad they look. Every day is a bad day, and they can't wait until it's their weekend again. This person is toxic to your agency because of their constant helplessness, their constant mistakes, and the constant absenteeism. Your other employees are having to cover for them, whether they're at work or whether they're not at work. And the mistakes that they're making make your agency look incompetent, and your other employees feel that. So when you're dealing with the hot mess, you first, again, need to determine what's making them that way. Just as in others, find out if there's a problem at home or if there's something in the workplace that's causing the issues. If there's issues at work that are the cause, handle those issues. If the problems are stemming from something at home, you can offer them resources to work through those problems. Most agencies have an employee assistance program, EAP, as part of their insurance. If yours does, offer to help the employee get some assistance through them, such as counseling. If that's not something available to them, then do what you can to help them find a resource. You might also encourage a physical exam and possibly a screening for ADD and other related issues. But if the problem has nothing to do with issues at home or at work, then you'll have to approach it from a corrective action perspective. In this case, you would have documented all the absences, the different mistakes, probably the appearance, whether that's in your general documentation or you've noted it in an annual evaluation and you've discussed each issue with the employee. If you've done that, then it's time to introduce a performance improvement plan or a PIP. And in the PIP, you will specify each of the issues that you have documented, dates, times, and what policy has been violated, whether that's agency or city or county. And then you'll also document what improvement you want to see in the future, and you will determine that future as far as the time frame, such as 90 days, and then you'll schedule regular meetings to review progress. If extra training is needed, then determine when and how that training will be provided. You want to support your employee, but you also need to support the other employees who are not toxic to your agency. And if you want a copy of a sample performance improvement plan, you can email me or send me a note in the Q&A, and I can send you a sample that I've created. Now, the pessimist is like a little black cloud hanging over everyone's head at work. Their negativity permeates every aspect of the job. This is the person who does a good job, whether call taking or dispatching, but every radio transmission or phone call is followed up with a language-filled rant about the caller, the officer, or the world in general. They get angry when an officer makes a request that they deem stupid, or when callers waste time on 911 with quote-unquote idiot calls. Regular tasks that have to be completed, like validations, will cause a stream of language that would make a sailor blush, and that's before they find a mistake in an entry that has to be corrected. Should there be something crazy and way out there expected, like an actual project, they erupt like Mount Vesuvius, and they criticize everyone regardless of their position or level of intelligence. Their constant complaining, foul language, and eruptions spread suspicion and doubt in everyone's mind, not to mention the fear of being the one to cause the eruption. Other employees tiptoe around them and then feel resentful of having to do so. Now, we all have negative emotions at work from time to time, I know, and we've probably all had choice words for a caller or a responder after hanging up or unkeying. The problem with the pessimist is they get so caught up in their negativity that they let it completely overtake them. To deal with them, we have to stop the pessimist from staying in that habit of complaining, whining, or disagreeing with everything. Now, one agency had an employee who was so negative and so angry that other employees began to fear her. After one particularly bad rant, during which she slammed the phone down, threw several items, and swore so loudly a caller heard her over someone else's headset, she was ordered into anger management in order to keep her job. So you can imagine how scared the other employees must have been to witness this kind of behavior. No one should have to be afraid at work. And having this kind of negativity definitely created a toxic and hostile work environment. Now, a tactic to try with the pessimist is to teach them how to give feedback. You know, we've all heard of the sandwich method, in which you sandwich a criticism between two pieces of positive feedback. Teaching the pessimist to use this method would temper their complaining, for one thing, and it might actually make them see the good side of things rather than always seeing only the bad side. Some people believe that knowledge is power, and in some cases it is, but it's never a good idea to have just one person with all the knowledge. For instance, many years ago, I worked for an agency in which the manager and his assistant were responsible for all the equipment in the center, including CAD, phones, radio, recorder, everything. And those of us who worked the floor were given only the information about these systems to do our jobs and nothing more. If we had a 911 call with an incorrect alley, we were told what blanks to fill in on the reporting sheet, but we were not told what any of those fields meant. Then when we went to enhance 911, we were told that we would get the address of the caller with the new system, but nothing else. When CAD was upgraded, we were taught how to do the new tasks, but not how those tasks related to anything else in the system. Well, one day, the manager turned in his retirement notice and was gone immediately. Approximately 2 days later, so was the assistant. And with those two resignations went all the knowledge about every system we had. They had been so controlling with the information because they both believed that knowledge was power. Unfortunately, neither one of them was able to see beyond that to see what would happen if all of that knowledge was gone. Our agency had to start from scratch, learning everything we could about all of it. At the time, the manager's assistant had been in the middle of implementing Phase 2 wireless, and we had not even heard about Phase 1. So the reason you have knowledge hoarders is because they want to ensure their jobs are secure. But in this case, not only was that attitude toxic, but it was also detrimental to the agency, as it left an entire city's 911 system without any internal support should something go wrong. And you know you're working with a knowledge hoarder if they are not team players, if they have independent processes, and if they have insecurities about work. So if you find you have an employee who thinks knowledge is power and they appear to be hoarding knowledge, you might consider rewarding actions of those who share new knowledge with others. Praise that employee who offers to train existing employees with that knowledge that not everyone has. If someone's gone away to training, let them come back in and share all of that information with everyone else, and then publicly thank and praise that employee. You also might consider developing a knowledge database, sort of a book of knowledge for your agency. So if you find your employee doing things in systems that others can't do, have them create a document with instructions and save it to that database. Get everybody sharing their knowledge and make that your agency's culture, is to share the knowledge rather than hoarding that knowledge. Okay, let's do another poll and start that. Have you ever successfully dealt with a toxic employee without terminating them? And if so, will you share your tactic in the Q&A pane? If you share your tactic in the Q&A pane, then I will compile those and I can send those out with the recording of the webinar so that everybody can see what tactic you used. Okay, so we've got about half and half. Some people have managed to do it and some people have not. Okay, oh, let me show that to y'all. There you go. Okay. Now, so we've talked about employees and toxic employees, but there's more. It's not just employees who are toxic. And if you've ever worked for a toxic boss, you'll be able to relate to this. So let's talk a bit about the types of toxic bosses and what you can do to deal with them. The manipulator is generally charming and charismatic, and they use those skills to get their employees to do things they'd rather not do. They'll give you tasks that you can't or don't want to do, and once that task is done, they'll take credit for it. But if the task fails, they'll blame you for the misinformation that you gave them. They will take on tasks and projects themselves that will bring them glory and recognition, but everything else will, as they say, roll downhill. They're masters of gaslighting, making you feel that you have misunderstood their directions and that's why you didn't do the task correctly, even though you wrote down every word and then restated your understanding of the task. The egotist believes he knows everything about how to run the department, regardless of whether he actually does or not. He surrounds himself with others who believe exactly as he does, resulting in a small army of himself. He rules from his office, rarely venturing out to check on his various divisions, not because he thinks they're running like a well-oiled machine, but because he doesn't think that they're important enough. When he issues orders and instructions, he does so at the top of his lungs. After all, everyone needs to hear what he has to say. He engages in office favoritism, dispensing punishment unequally, and he often bases those decisions on the things that he's heard while participating in office gossip. And he doesn't sleep because he's often up in the middle of the night coming up with new brilliant plans for you to execute the next day. Plans that will fail because he hasn't asked anyone involved for their input. The time sucker controls everyone's time, but doesn't care if they're late. They're unconcerned with your personal or professional time, and they will come to you at the last minute with a project or a report that must be done right then. And after you've spent most of your day working on the project or stayed late to get the report done, then they'll tell you, oh, don't worry about that, it's not needed. Time suckers may also use your work time to discuss personal problems. They come to you with a project, and in the course of discussing the project, they might mention something personal. Trying to be polite, you ask them a question about it, and the next thing you know, they're now spending 2 to 3 hours in your office daily talking about their personal issues. In the meantime, that state report that's due this afternoon just sits there as your time goes down the drain. Oh, and let's not forget the mandatory meetings every single week that take 2 to 3 hours and could have been handled by email. The wannabe friend may not be as ruthless as some of the other toxic bosses, but they can still be demoralizing to work for. The wannabe friend will completely ignore professional boundaries, and will immediately start asking you personal questions right off the bat. They can't distinguish those work and personal boundaries, and you end up being in a friendship that you didn't want, but you feel that you need to participate in so that you can keep your job. You'll hear lame and off-color jokes. You find yourself going to some strange places to eat and or hang out. And you'd like to tell your boss they've crossed a line, but you don't dare. And then you've got the micromanager. I'm sure we've all worked for one of these before because they are the most common type of toxic boss in the workplace. The micromanager watches everything you do and every step you take. They may have trained you once upon a time, and they expect you to continue to do everything exactly the way they taught you. Remember the toxic trainer that I mentioned earlier who wanted trainees to put arrest paperwork in exactly the same order she did? That's one. You may have heard me talk about a boss I had once who would have me write letters to CLEX about contracts. I would write the letter, proud of my brilliant prose in expressing our need, but by the time she was finished rewording it, she might as well have written it herself, and I had just wasted my time. So here's what the micromanager says to themselves to justify the micromanaging. It will save time if I just do it myself. But what they mean is, I don't believe it's worth my time to let them try because they won't get it right anyway. Too much is at stake to allow it to go wrong. But what they're thinking is, I don't trust them to do their jobs according to my standards. They think it's my credibility on the line if we don't get it done on time. But what they think is, the work won't get done unless I constantly prod them. They say when I'm not involved, they mess up. But what they mean is the one time I yielded some control, there was a mistake, and I'm not willing to take that risk again. And then they say that my boss wants me to be heavily involved in my team's work. What they think is, if I don't stay involved, how else will I prove my worth? So as an employee of a micromanager, it's easy to get discouraged thinking you can never do anything right. So if any of these sound like your boss, you may be relieved to find out that it really isn't you, it's them. But what can you do about it? Your boss isn't going to change. They got to be that way for a reason, whether personal or business related, and they became toxic before you came along. And like the saying goes, you can't change someone, you can only change your reaction to them. So let's look at how we're going to do that. You're going to protect yourself mentally. Realize that you're not at fault and you're not alone. If you're feeling it, others are too. Talk to your friends, talk to support groups, or talk to a counselor. It helps if you can find others who feel the same way. Protect yourself legally. We all tend to underestimate toxic bosses and how far they will go until they actually go there. So don't let your guard down. Document everything. Conversations, project assignments, discussions about pay, even time off requests. There is nothing too small to document. Make sure you have dates and times, who else was present, and the location. And this is especially important when documenting any kind of harassment or hostile workplace. Relax in your off time. I know that we're all working overtime to cover shortages, especially with the holidays coming up, but you need to take time to get away from the stress, and a toxic workplace is stressful. Don't read work emails off duty if you can get away with it. Fill your time with things you like to do, things that will take your mind away from the toxicity. Develop some new hobbies, or take some different classes that don't have anything to do with work, like macrame or something. Um, Anything to get your mind away and let your mind take time off. Accept their behavior. This actually may be the hardest one to do because we all want to make the toxic people change, but thinking that's possible is even more stressing. They may have a momentary lapse of reasoning and actually say something nice one day, and that'll make you think, wow, they've actually turned a corner. Don't fall for it. As hard as their toxicity is to deal with, it'll be even harder if you let yourself think that they've changed. Plus, the sooner you accept the way they are, the sooner you can plan strategies to move forward. And don't blame them. Toxic people want one thing, and that's for their anger and frustration to be real. If you lash out at them, it justifies their actions, and it tells them that they were right to treat you negatively. So don't give them that satisfaction. Just write it out until one of you can leave. So let's do our last poll. If you've worked for a toxic boss, do you feel stronger for having dealt with it? Okay, it's evening up a little bit. So 60-ish, 30-ish. So a lot of you feel stronger for having dealt with it. And about 30% of you say no. And I can tell you, I'm not sure that I feel stronger yet. I might one day, but I just don't know yet. Now, the most difficult part of working with toxic people is that you lose part of yourself, your work self. You no longer love your job. It just becomes a chore you have to do. You drag yourself out of bed every day to go to a place you don't want to be, to work with someone you don't like. Even if you leave that job, you don't automatically go back to being your old self. You don't trust your new coworkers or your new boss, and where you might have been fun and outgoing before, you're now quiet, careful, and watchful. The one thing you can find relief in is knowing that you now have a new experience, and that's dealing with a toxic person. It will never be as bad as it was the first time because you have new skills now and you'll handle it a different way. You are in control of your life now, not toxic people. Okay, before we get to questions, I want to remind you to tune in next month, same bat time, same bat channel, Wednesday, December 2nd at noon Central Time, for our next webinar and our last webinar in the series, Leading Through the Relationship Minefield. We all have relationships at work, whether they're friendly, adversarial, romantic, or just business. It's not always easy to be a leader in some of these instances, and in fact, it can be like walking through a minefield. So in next month's session, we will talk about ways to lead through these relationships, whether they're yours or your employees. Okay, so let me open it up for questions here. And yes, I will send you a sample tip. Okay, so dealing with one right now involving a lot of documentation, and that's good. That documentation will save you. So one, ask them for their, one that you dealt with. You asked them for their long-term goals within the agency and told them how continuing their behavior wouldn't let them move forward as they wanted. Okay, and that settled it. Some of them had to reevaluate their inner circle that brings out the toxic. Oh, interesting. Just lost my place. And that is a very good point right there. Reevaluate their inner circle that brings out the toxic behavior. Okay, our toxic hot mess just resigned from their position for another job. They had the second most tenure of the group and was the least motivated. That's exactly one that I had. We institute a point system to reward positive work ethic, working extra shifts, high scoring QA, QI, signing up for on-call. Since a majority of our staff have less than 5 years, we wanted to ensure that the opportunities for good shifts and opportunities did not only go to the tenured staff, so we used the point system. Oh, that is an excellent idea. Very good. I like that. And yes, I will send these out to y'all because these are some very good points here. Bidding and training opportunities. Okay, so that's what you're talking about. My strategy for successfully dealing with toxic employees: call them out on the floor in front of others, depends on the behavior action, empower them to solve a problem they are unhappy about, address their behavior during monthly one-on-ones. Okay, monthly one-on-ones, that's a good idea. Very good idea there. Hot mess was consistently at the bottom of the points total, shifts work, available leave, calls answered, and calls dispatched. The only thing they exceeded everyone in was the amount of leave taken. Okay, we met with the employees several times and explained that the work ethic they were putting forth was placing a lot of additional pressure on their coworkers, which was affecting the willingness of those other coworkers to do favors for the hot mess. We really were not getting anywhere with the employees. Our course of action was to be supportive in the employee seeking other employment. Oh, very good. We came to the conclusion that there was no reasonable solution for the employee because they were burnt out. And yes, generally that happens with the most tenured. The employee didn't want to work nights or weekends, which is impossible. The employee did not recognize or accept that their absence affected others and that their actions were selfish in nature. So we decided to support the employee in finding another job that would better fit their expectations. I think the moral is you can't always fix people, so it's important to recognize when to offer what help you can to move them on to a better situation for them. Very, very good. And I will tell you that that our hot mess retired with 20 years on the books and no time on the books. So yes, you will get a link in the email probably later today, no later than tomorrow. So you'll have this whole, the recording of this whole webinar. It is hard to bounce back from dealing with a toxic boss. It does leave you feeling like where you may have felt like you could move mountains before. Now I'm not sure that I would recognize a mountain, but I'm getting better. I did see a hill the other day, so it is hard to bounce back. Okay, I'll send you a copy of the form. I have one that is new but came from another agency. She feels like she should be further along but is not willing to do anything to move forward. She complains with every task and phone call. We just talked about it in her review, but I have not had consistent improvement. Suggestions on how to address it without it seeming like I am constantly criticizing. So this was one issue that I had when I talked about the one that I had concerns about. There were red flags and I ignored the red flags, and then within 6 weeks she had the entire communication center pitted against each other. She had come from another agency as a supervisor, And we did expect a lot from her because she had been a supervisor. But part of the problem was that she was kind of trying to rest on her laurels. The fact that she had been a supervisor meant that she didn't need to try at our agency because she already knew everything pretty much. And so when her trainer who is trying to train her, she thinks her trainer's an idiot, and so she's turned to the side and she's got her phone out of her purse and she's texting. And, we had to talk to her about that. We had to talk to her about taking breaks to go use her phone constantly. I finally had to have her leave her purse, her phone, everything in her locker. And what it came down to was documenting every single time we had to tell her to put her phone down. Every time we had to tell her to pay attention and quit emailing, because she was emailing another employee while she was trying to train on the radio. And well, no, actually she was still training on the phones, but she was emailing constantly rather than looking at her screen or trying to figure out how to do other tasks. So we documented every single time that we told her anything. If we told it to her yesterday, if we told it to her this morning, we documented every single time. And we made sure that her scores were low on her DORs. Because, obviously the higher the score, the more it means they can do that job by themselves, and she couldn't. So what eventually ended up getting her fired was the fact that in her emails back and forth to this employee, she ended up telling this other employee that we were a bunch of effing idiots, and in 2 weeks they'd be running circles around us. So that was actually what finally got her job. But she was well on her way out the door just from the documentation that we had. Now, as you're doing this documentation, you want to make sure that whoever is above you is in the know about what's going on, about what you're documenting, and that they are behind you while you're doing this, you're not going to take all this documentation to them and then they're going to say, well, we're just going to give them another chance, give them to another trainer. You want to make sure that they understand what's going on, what you're documenting, and all of that. So provide the email to request the, yes, you can send it to training at comelectronics, COM electronics.com to get what you need to report this. And it'll be in the email that you'll get with the recording also. And yes, I will send you a copy of the PIP also. So if there are no more questions, then I will tell you thank you for joining us, and remind you this presentation has been made possible by Commercial Electronics, provider of public safety solutions, including Higher Ground, NG 911 recording, Live 911, and CQIP, our third-party quality assurance program. One more, what do you do when the employee doesn't believe they're toxic, even when you show them proof? That's another thing where you need to continue to document, and you have to tell them that these are your expectations. You expect them to do this, and if they can't do that, then the next step is going to be termination. So they may not ever see, sorry y'all, they may not ever see that they're toxic, but if they don't, then it's time that they just need to go. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And if you have any more questions, just email me. Otherwise, everyone have a great day and have a great rest of the week. Catch y'all next month.